whistles in the dark. Some things walk beside you, not to scare you, but to remind you they're still there. It crossed the road in 3 steps. That's how Dean Parker always begins the story, though his voice lowers each time. Like part of him still doesn't believe it. 1 second it was just headlights and night. The next, something enormous moved across the asphalt. Taller than any man, broader than any bear, and faster than anything that size should ever be. He didn't stop the car at first, just gripped the wheel tighter and stared ahead like nothing happened. Carl, riding shotgun, whispered, "You saw that too, right?" And Dean could only nod. There was no point in pretending otherwise. Something had crossed their path that night, deep in the woods near Humptulips. Something that shouldn't exist, but did. That was the first time. The second time, Dean was alone, on foot, and they didn't cross in front of him this time. They walked with him, on either side. For several long minutes through a dark, empty road near the canal. They stayed there in the trees, watching, whistling, making sounds that weren't quite human, and weren't meant to be. Dean Parker is a man of few words, a carpenter, a tribal member of the Makah Nation, a man raised on stories told by firelight, stories he once thought were myths, until the myths stepped out of the forest. This is not a story about proving Sasquatch exists. This is about what happens when you already know. Most folks around Neah Bay don't talk about the old stories unless they've had one too many or the power's out and the fire's crackling just right. But Dean Parker didn't need the dark or the whiskey to start remembering. The memories came anyway, sharp, uninvited, like a splinter buried deep under skin. They started with the eyes. Not human, not angry either. Just aware. Like the forest itself had turned its head and looked back. Dean had lived his whole life near the water, under skies that smelled of salt and pine, among people who understood silence better than they did noise. The Makah were a people of memory, of deep water and deeper woods. They knew that the world had layers, that just because something couldn't be explained didn't mean it wasn't real. He hadn't believed the stories growing up. Not really. He'd sit near the fire as a boy, eyes wide, listening to his grandfather talk about the box. That's what they called them. Not Bigfoot, not Sasquatch, box. The ones who walked without a sound, the ones who watched from the trees and whistled when no one else was around. Dean would shiver when the wind came down from the hills just right and made the trees sing. But by morning, it always felt like make-believe again. Childhood is good at forgetting what's inconvenient. Then came that night near Humptulips. A logging town turned ghost shadow. Miles of nothing but back roads and cold air that never stopped moving. Dean was driving, Carl beside him. Both of them headed home from Squamish after helping a cousin patch up a roof. It was late, past midnight. The kind of quiet where even the radio seems too loud. The headlights stretched long down the 2-lane road, carving slices out of the dark. They were laughing. Something about Carl's uncle and a canoe that wouldn't float straight. Then, just like that, silence, not because anyone stopped talking. Because something had changed in the air. A shift. The trees seemed to close in tighter, like the night was holding its breath. And then it happened. 3 steps. That's all it took. 3 impossibly long, impossibly smooth strides. It moved like it had been waiting. Like it knew the road would be empty. The headlights just bright enough. Tall. Too tall. Covered in hair that looked soaked with rain, even though it wasn't raining. Broad shoulders, long arms. It never looked at them, but somehow Dean felt seen. The thing didn't hesitate, didn't flinch, just crossed and vanished into the woods on the other side. No sound, no crash of underbrush, just gone. He slammed the brakes too late. The car coasted 10, maybe 15 feet before he pulled over. He didn't speak, didn't dare. His hands were locked on the wheel, skin white under knuckles. Carl whispered, "You saw that too, right?" Dean nodded. They sat there a long time. Neither of them moved. Neither of them wanted to. The woods had grown too still again. That kind of silence that presses against your chest. He remembers the rest of the drive in fragments. Trees, fog, the rhythmic bump of tires over cracks in the asphalt. And Carl completely quiet, except once, when he muttered, "I don't ever want to come back this way again." Dean didn't answer. He was still replaying the steps, still counting them. 1, 2, 3. He told himself he was tired, that his mind had filled in a shape from shadows. But he knew better. That wasn't imagination. That wasn't a bear. That wasn't a human. The days after were worse. Carl stopped taking his calls. When Dean did see him at the hardware store weeks later, Carl barely met his eyes. And when he did, there was a kind of hollow in them, like something inside him had been misplaced. Dean tried telling people, once, a cousin, a fishing buddy. Once, a cousin, a fishing buddy. No one laughed exactly, but they gave him that look. The one people give when you say something just enough out of bounds to make them uncomfortable. So he stopped. But the woods didn't. He started hearing things. Late at night, a whistle, just once, just outside the tree line, like someone calling a dog that wasn't there. Sometimes in dreams, sometimes wide awake. Dean began driving different roads, longer ways home, roads with gas stations and billboards and streetlights, roads where the shadows didn't shift quite so much. But still, he remembered. There's a line you cross when the unbelievable becomes memory. When the world expands in one terrifying moment and never shrinks back again. He had crossed that line near Humptulips. But what he didn't know yet, what none of us ever really know, is that once something like that sees you, really sees you, it doesn't forget either. It moved like it had been waiting. That was the thought stuck in Dean's head, long after the road behind them had swallowed the moment whole, after the headlights had flicked past trees and fence posts, after Carl went silent and never broke it, after they got home and didn't speak again for 2 days. He could still see it, those 3 steps. That's all it took. Not a sprint, not a run, just stride, smooth and confident, like it wasn't crossing through something, but returning into it, like the woods belonged to it, like it belonged to the woods. Dean never forgot the way the light hit its back, hair hanging in matted strands, thick and wet-looking, as if the forest had given it a coat of shadows. It didn't make a sound. Not a branch snapped, not a footfall, that size. It should thundered when it moved. But it was quiet, unnervingly quiet. And somehow that silence was louder than any scream. When the car finally rolled to a stop, the heater was still on, humming softly like a ghost trying to whisper something it couldn't quite say. Dean sat there, hands glued to the steering wheel, knuckles like stone. His chest tightened. Not with fear, not at first, with understanding. This wasn't a creature out of place. He was, they were. Carl finally spoke. "Barely. You saw that too, right?" His voice was hoarse, like it had swallowed dust. Dean didn't answer, just nodded. Slow, like if he moved too fast, something might still be watching. They didn't turn the car around, didn't try to investigate. Dean isn't even sure why. Something deep in his bones, something ancient, told him not to. And when you grow up where stories outlive people, you learn to listen to your bones. The rest of the drive home was molasses. Time stretched and coiled like it didn't want to move forward. Carl smoked 3 cigarettes and didn't say another word. Dean kept his eyes on the road, but his mind was still back there, trying to fit the pieces of the world back together, trying to make the woods small again. But they wouldn't shrink. At home, Dean didn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table until dawn, a cup of cold coffee untouched in front of him, replaying it all. The steps, the size, the absence of fear in the thing. It hadn't run. It hadn't even cared. It hadn't needed to. That was the first real crack in Dean's reality, the part where belief stopped being a choice. A few days later, He called Carl. Voicemail. Left a message. Just said, "Hey, you good?" Never heard back. They didn't speak again. Not properly. Not for months. When they did run into each other at the Ace Hardware in Forks, Carl just looked through him, like he didn't want to remember. Like he'd buried the night in a box too heavy to lift again. Dean started to notice other things. A shift in how people looked at him when he brought it up. Once, over coffee with his cousin Jacob, he tried to tell the story, tried to lay it out plain. Jacob just smiled, nodded, and said, "You've been drinking too much late-night History Channel." Dean didn't laugh. He stopped talking after that, but he didn't stop feeling. There was something different now. He could sense it when he walked alone through the trees behind his workshop. He began noticing small changes, like how the birds would go quiet too suddenly, or how a stretch of woods he'd walked through for years suddenly made his skin crawl. He'd stop, listen, and feel the pressure, like the air had weight, and always the sense that something was just beyond the edge of sight. Weeks passed, then months. The memory stayed sharp. He scoured books, online forums, reports from hunters, forest rangers, tribal archives. It was all there. Stories like his. A logger in 72 near Elma. A fisherman from Tohola. A hiker who swore he saw something pacing him in the Quinault woods for 2 hours. Always the same pieces. Height, hair, silence, and those goddamn 3 steps. But what stuck with Dean more than anything were the sounds. It started late one night, maybe around 2, when the wind had died down and the only noise was the creak of his old screen door. He was sitting on the back porch, thinking about nothing in particular. Then, whistle. Soft, deliberate, too short to be wind, too curved to be human. It came from the tree line. He froze, waited, nothing. Then, again, this time from the opposite side. Then, nothing. He stood, looked out into the dark. But he didn't step off the porch, just stood there. Jaw clenched, listening. That sound. It wasn't threatening. Not exactly. It was inviting. But that's what scared him more. And here's the hook. The line that split the story wide open. Whatever that was out there, it didn't come to be seen. It came to see if I was ready to follow. From that night on, Dean stopped going out after dark. Even when he had work to finish. Even when the dogs barked at nothing near the edge of the woods. Even when the wind stopped and the night turned too still. Because whatever had walked across that road near Humptulips hadn't just passed by. It marked him for a long time after that night. Dean didn't talk about it. Not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know how. There are things that slip so far outside the edges of what people are willing to believe that just bringing them up feels like stepping into quicksand. One wrong word and the ground swallows you whole. But the silence wasn't empty. It followed him. It watched him work. It crept into the corners of his thoughts like a draft under a locked door. He started waking up in the middle of the night, not because of dreams, but because of something quieter. An awareness, like something outside was waiting for him to look out the window. And once he did. It was around 3 a.m. A mist had settled low on the tree line behind his house, and he could see the outline of something tall, not moving, just there. He didn't turn the light on. He didn't blink. And eventually, it was gone, but not forgotten. That image, still a stone, half swallowed by the fog, would stay with him longer than the thing on the road, because that time it wasn't moving away. It was watching him stay. He tried reaching out to Carl again, more out of some twisted need to confirm it hadn't all been in his head. No answer, not a word. The silence between them was louder than ever, thick like smoke. They'd shared something that night, something that shouldn't have existed. And now it was like Carl was trying to bury it alive. And maybe Dean was, too. He buried himself in work, built cabinets, rewired old trailers, took odd jobs from folks in the area who didn't ask questions and paid in cash. But every night he came home, the woods waited for him like they hadn't finished their sentence. So one morning, after waking up with his shirt damp from sweat and the sheets twisted into ropes, he drove down to the tribal library. It was one of those buildings most people forget even exists. Small, quiet, too cold, even in summer. He wasn't looking for proof. He didn't need it. What he needed was language. A way to explain what he knew without sounding insane. He asked for the old records. Oral history transcriptions, elders' interviews, field notes from researchers who'd visited back in the 70s. The librarian didn't blink. She just pointed him to a back room and said, "You're not the first." That sentence hit him harder than he expected. Over the next few weeks, Dean sat for hours combing through fragile paper and fading ink. The names changed, but the pattern didn't. Tall figures. Whistles, hissing sounds, unseen watchers. Some said they were guardians, others, warnings. A few believed they were spirits between worlds, walking on the edge of visibility. But one story stopped him cold. It was a recounting from a Mecca woman named Elsie Walker, 1962. She said they came to her after her husband died in a logging accident, walked alongside her for 5 nights in a row as she mourned. She said they never touched her, never spoke, just whistled softly, like they were keeping her company from the dark. Then they vanished. She ended her account with one line, scrawled in shaky pen: "They walk beside the ones who carry the weight of silence." Dean read that sentence 5 times. Then he closed the folder and sat in stillness for what felt like an hour. That night, it happened again. A single whistle, then another. From opposite sides of his property. This time, he didn't freeze. He didn't hide. He walked out onto his porch, arms crossed, breath steaming in the cold. No movement, no eyes staring back. But the air felt full, heavy with presence. And that's when something shifted inside him. Not fear, exactly, something closer to surrender. He realized that maybe this wasn't about being afraid of what was out there. Maybe it was about understanding why he had been chosen to see it. Because it wasn't random. He could feel that in his bones. The woods don't make mistakes. The real question wasn't why it crossed the road. It was, why did it want him to see it? That thought broke something open. And here's where the story turned. Here's the moment that pulled him deeper. I thought I just witnessed something. But maybe I'd been invited into something much older than myself. In the following days, Dean started listening more. Really listening. To the way the wind shifted through the trees. To the gaps in bird calls. To the sudden, inexplicable stillness that dropped like a curtain in certain pockets of forest. He noticed when dogs barked at nothing. When deer changed direction without reason. He started to read the forest like a second language. One passed down not through words but through presence. But the more he listened, the clearer it became. This wasn't over. It hadn't even begun. The road was just the introduction. The silence that followed was the invitation. And whatever lived out there, it was waiting for him to answer. He didn't know it yet. But the next time he would see them, he wouldn't be behind a windshield. He'd be walking, alone, on foot, with no lights, no protection, and no one to turn to. And this time, they wouldn't just cross. They'd walk with him. Dean didn't plan to be out that night. He never did anymore. Not since the road, not since the sound. But sometimes the world pulls you into places you swore you'd left behind. That night, it started with a short drive to deliver a repaired outboard motor to a neighbor south of the canal. Straightforward, in and out. Only, by the time he was done, the sun had slipped away unnoticed. The road back stretched dark and narrow, not a soul in sight. He should have waited till morning, but he didn't. The old gravel road beside the canal wasn't one he traveled often anymore. Not because it was unsafe, but because it felt watched. It curved like a spine, through heavy cedar and sat low enough that even moonlight had trouble getting in. Most folks avoided it after dark. Most folks didn't walk it alone. That night, Dean didn't have a choice. He parked the truck where the road met the gate and started the walk back toward the main highway, a 1.5-mile stretch of blacktop wrapped in shadow. No flashlight, no cell signal, only the soft shuffle of boots over dirt and the sound of his breath. And then came the first whistle, soft, high, not cheerful, curious, like someone imitating a bird but with the wrong kind of mouth. Dean stopped mid-step. A few seconds passed. Then a second whistle came. Lower, from the opposite side. He turned slowly, eyes narrowing into the woods. Darkness bled through the branches like oil. Nothing moved, but the space between the trees felt too full, like the air had weight. He kept walking. They didn't follow behind. That was the strange part. They kept pace with him, one on each side, deep in the brush, just out of sight, not close enough to see, but near enough that he could feel them. They weren't hunting. They weren't chasing. They were walking with him. The sound of feet over wet leaves came and went in rhythm with his own steps. He tried stopping again. They stopped too, waited, silent. Then, just as he started moving, they did too. Whistle, kiss, whistle. Dean's heartbeat spiked, but his breath stayed level. Somehow, beneath the shock, the fear, there was something else rising inside him. Not panic, recognition. It was happening again. But this wasn't like before. They weren't crossing his path. They were inviting him into theirs. Every few steps, he scanned the tree line. He could swear he saw outlines. Tall, still, just swaying slightly with the trees. But every time he blinked, they vanished. The sounds kept him moving. Not menacing, not friendly either. Just present. They knew he was there. They wanted him to know they knew. At some point, he realized he'd stopped breathing through his mouth. He was matching the rhythm of their whistles, their kissing sounds, as if falling into a strange kind of unspoken language. One that didn't need words, just presence. And then came the hook, sharp and unexpected. That was the moment I knew. They hadn't followed me out of the woods. I'd been walking into theirs the whole time. It felt like a ceremony, not of welcome, not of threat, something older, observational, like they were watching who he was when the lights went out and the road disappeared. For almost 4 minutes, they flanked him like silent guardians or careful shadows. Dean didn't run. He didn't even walk fast. It wasn't bravery. It was something colder, a calm that didn't belong to him, but felt handed down from something deeper than blood. A few minutes later, headlights broke through the bend ahead. A truck coming from the highway, slow and distant. The moment it appeared, the sound stopped. No more whistles, no more breathing, no more footfalls. Just absence. Dean kept walking until the truck pulled up beside him. A local guy, friend of a friend, asked if he needed a ride. Dean said, thanks, and climbed in. Man asked, what are you doing out here in the dark, Dean? He almost said it, almost told him everything, laid it all out right there in the cab. But the words didn't come. He looked out the window, into the trees now so quiet, they might as well have never existed. And he said, just needed some air. The man nodded, as if that made perfect sense. They drove in silence, but Dean's mind stayed behind. In the woods, in the hush that followed those last steps. He wasn't sure what it meant yet, why they let him walk, why they never showed themselves fully, why it felt like trust. What he did know was this. They weren't gone, and next time, they wouldn't wait for him to be alone. The moment the headlights broke through the curve of the road, Dean felt the pressure lift, like something massive had been sitting on his chest, and finally rolled off into the trees. That faint rumble of tires on gravel, that soft hum of a Vate engine echoing through the dark, it wasn't just sound. It was rescue. It was return. And for a second, just a breath, he wondered if the things beside him, the ones that had walked in lockstep with him for almost 4 minutes, would show themselves. Step out from the tree line, reveal something true, but they didn't. They vanished the second the light touched the edge of the woods. Gone, like mist when the sun comes up. The truck slowed beside him, a muddy Ford that looked like it hadn't been washed since the Clinton administration. Dean squinted through the glare, heart still hammering in that strange, silent rhythm. The driver leaned across the cab, window down, voice casual, too good, Dean. He didn't answer right away. The smell of pine and wet road clung to his jacket. His boots felt heavier than they should. He was still listening, even though the sounds were gone. Still waiting for a whistle that wouldn't come. "Yeah," he said finally. "Just needed to stretch my legs." The driver didn't press. Folks around here knew when not to ask. Dean climbed in, shut the door, and let the silence inside the cab wrap around him like a second skin. They drove in silence. Not awkward, not forced. Just quiet. Like neither of them wanted to admit they both felt the woods watching them in the rearview mirror. Dean kept his eyes on the passenger window. Outside, the trees flicked past like black flames, and for the first time, he wondered if the things that walked beside him were ever really in the trees to begin with, or if they were walking in him. The drive felt longer than it should have. Time got weird out there. Elastic, like the road knew he wasn't supposed to leave so soon. But eventually, they made it back to the highway, where the world was normal again. Fast food wrappers, blinking traffic lights, the distant glow of convenience stores. Still, something stayed behind, or maybe followed. That night, Dean didn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen table again, same seat as before, same cold coffee untouched. He replayed the walk in his mind, frame by frame, the way the sounds mirrored his pace, the way the presence wasn't threatening, but also wasn't human. It wasn't curiosity. It was something else. Something older. And that's when the question came, uninvited, but sharp as a knife. If they didn't want to hurt me, why show up at all? The answer didn't come in words. It came in memory, a feeling. The first night on the road near Humptulips, the look, not seen but felt. That unspoken knowing that passed between him and whatever that thing was, before it disappeared into the trees. It wasn't fear it left him with. It was responsibility, as if by seeing them, by surviving them, he had inherited something. A burden. A secret. Or worse, a calling. He started dreaming in fragments. Not nightmares, but something quieter. More unsettling. Trees that bent the wrong way. Whistles that echoed inside buildings. Footsteps in water when he was standing alone on dry land. He'd wake up sweating, eyes wide, heart steady. Not racing, but waiting. Always waiting. And slowly he started to understand what the silence meant. It wasn't absence. It was trust. They hadn't shown themselves fully because he wasn't ready. Not then. Not yet. But they were watching. They had always been watching. And the next time, they wouldn't come in shadow. They'd come in form. He told no one. Not because he was afraid of being laughed at. That part was long gone. But because the moment he tried to share it, he could feel it slip away. Like trying to explain music with math. Some things aren't made to be spoken. They're made to be felt. For weeks, he avoided that stretch of road. But the dreams kept coming, and so did the signs. One morning, he found his front porch covered in fine cedar bark, laid out in small circular piles, perfectly even. No wind the night before. No animals that couldn't have done it. Just there. He swept it up, but didn't throw it away. The next night, there were whistles again. Distant. One high, one low. Call and response. Dean stood in the dark, porch light off, listening. They weren't just checking in. They were reminding him, "You've seen us. You've heard us. Next time, you'll have to understand us." And for the first time since all this began, Dean didn't feel afraid. He felt chosen. But that didn't make it easier, because understanding them would mean going further. And the woods had only just begun to open. It started with a question that wouldn't let go. What are they? Not what did I see, not what crossed the road, not what walked with me, but what are they real? When you strip away the folklore, the blurry photos, the jokes, the fear, it followed Dean like smoke, curling under doors, leaking into everything he thought he understood about the forest, about himself, about the stories he once thought were only for scaring kids around a fire. He didn't ask anyone anymore. He'd learned by now the silence was better. Not just because people wouldn't believe him, but because they were still listening. He could feel it. In the spaces between thoughts, in the way animals would freeze, ears twitching toward places no sound came from, in the way his breath caught when he stepped outside at night, not from cold, but from that odd sense of being witnessed. They hadn't shown themselves again, not the way they had that night by the canal. But they hadn't left either. And he knew it. Dean started waking up before dawn, just to sit in the dark and listen. Not out of fear anymore, out of habit, out of need. The forest had become a second language, and now he couldn't stop hearing it. There were patterns in the silence, conversations in the wind. Sometimes he thought he heard footfalls behind the house. Soft, heavy, deliberate. He stopped checking. It wasn't a haunting. It was a relationship. And then came the old man. He was sitting by the dock one morning when Dean showed up early with a thermos and a weathered book of Maka symbols. The man looked like part of the shoreline, lined face, hands like driftwood, eyes dark with things that don't get spoken. He was carving something into cedar, humming low. "You've been hearing the whistles," the man said, without looking up. Dean didn't answer, didn't need to. "They don't come for everyone," the old man said. "They come for the ones who walk between things." Dean asked, "What are they?" And the man just smiled. "Soft, without teeth. What are you?" Dean waited, but that was all he got. So he kept digging. Through stories, through history, through what little had been written down by those who took the time to listen instead of explain. There were words, old ones, that had no clean English translation. Words that meant things like the ones who shadow the living or those who walk and do not break the branch. Words that describe presence without weight, mind without eyes. But none of them named what he'd seen. That was the thing. Every culture had words for them. But none dared label them too clearly, as if the act of naming would violate something sacred, or worse, invite something in. And then came the memory. He wasn't sleeping. He wasn't dreaming. It just arrived, whole and sharp. He was maybe 8 years old, walking through the forest with his grandfather. They were collecting mushrooms after the rain, soft moss underfoot, light still gray from dawn. And he remembered a whistle. High, then low, and his grandfather stopping so suddenly that Dean nearly bumped into him. The old man had turned slowly, eyes scanning the trees with a look Dean didn't understand at the time. Half respect, half warning. Then he'd said one sentence Dean hadn't remembered until now. "Don't look for it, but let it know you're not looking away." And now, as an adult, those words hit like thunder. He'd been touched by this thing long before the road, long before the canal. It had always been around the edges, maybe not watching, but waiting. The realization came cold and full of steel. This wasn't about them finding me. This was about them deciding I'd finally remembered. He didn't know what to do with that. It changed everything. This wasn't a haunting. This was inheritance. And suddenly, everything inside him started to shift, like muscle moving over old bone. His understanding of the forest deepened. The sounds, the silences, The feeling that space could hold something vast and alive just out of reach. He stopped questioning whether they were real. He started questioning what being seen by them had made him. Sometimes, late at night, he'd stand barefoot in the backyard, eyes closed, hands loose at his sides, listening, waiting. Not for them to show themselves, but for them to answer. But forest answered around them. Owls that stopped calling all at once. Coyotes that yipped only once, then vanished. Trees that never swayed even when the wind came through strong. One night, a branch snapped behind the shed. Not close, but not far either. Dean turned to look, expecting nothing. Instead, he saw eyes. Not glowing, not red. Just there, deep-set, intelligent, unblinking. Then they blinked and were gone. He didn't move for a long time. He just whispered to no one, "I know, I know," because now he did. But knowing wasn't comfort. Knowing was responsibility. And the worst part was, he didn't know what for. Not yet. Not fully. But the next time those whistles came, he wouldn't just hear them. He'd follow. Dean stopped trying to explain the difference between seeing something and being changed by it. That line, that break in the old self, it doesn't leave a scar you can point to. It lives behind the eyes and the way you move through the world after. The way you pause at the edge of the tree line for a second longer than you used to. The way you no longer hear silence the same way again. That change isn't loud. It's quiet, like a page turning itself. He started drawing again, not for anyone else. Not to prove anything. Just because the images wouldn't stop coming. They came in flashes, half-formed figures, tree lines with eyes inside them. Outlines of movement frozen mid-step. The first few sketches were shaky, like memory fighting against logic. But the more he drew, the clearer they became. Not just in form, but in meaning. It wasn't art. It was transcription. And then, one morning, he woke up with a need. Not a thought, not a plan, a need. He pulled out an old cedar panel from the shop and began carving. Hands moved without conscious direction. Muscle remembered something the mind didn't. Shapes formed, circles, spirals, tall figures beneath an arc of trees, stars over their heads, eyes without pupils, feet without shadows. When it was done, Dean just stared at it. Because that was the moment it hit him. He hadn't created something new. He'd remembered something ancient. It all came rushing back. The stories his grandfather told when he was a kid. The ones he thought were too poetic, too vague. Not warnings, not threats, but markers. Like stars to navigate by. And now he could see the pattern beneath the stories. They weren't just about creatures in the woods. They were about people who came back different. He thought had been haunted. He hadn't. He'd been initiated. For days after the carving, the air around his cabin changed. Birds returned, but only to the outer edges. Coyotes came closer at night, but never crossed the line of river rocks he'd placed without knowing why. He didn't hear the whistles again, but he didn't need to. The space they used to fill was now inside him. A tuning fork struck once, now humming through his blood. That was when he stopped locking his doors. Not out of bravery, but because he realized something terrifying and oddly comforting at once. Whatever they are, if they wanted to come in, locks wouldn't matter. He began walking again. Not far, not deep, just into the edge of the woods at dusk, just far enough to let the shadows touch his boots. Listening, not calling. He didn't ask for anything. He just showed up. One evening, he brought the carving with him, set it down on a moss-covered stump where the tree line curved like an open mouth. He didn't say a word. Just placed it there and walked away. The next morning, it was gone. Not stolen, not moved, gone. No drag marks, no footprints, not even disturbed soil, just absence. Dean didn't panic. He didn't smile either. He simply nodded like someone who finally heard the answer to a question they didn't know they'd been asking their entire life. The days after blurred. He moved through them gently, quietly, like walking through a sacred place. Everything took on new weight. Sounds, shapes, small movements of wind. He noticed more. Felt more. As if the world had dialed itself sharper. And that's when the final truth started blooming in his chest. They didn't show themselves completely because they weren't meant to be seen fully. They were meant to remind, to tether, to warn, to choose. And he had been chosen, not as a prophet or a victim or even a witness, but as a bridge, a man between two worlds, between old and new, between the known and the unnamed. It didn't give him peace. It gave him purpose. But that purpose came with weight. And weight, when not carried right, can bury you. He started writing, not for publication. Not even for memory, but for legacy. In case one day someone else saw the shadows move too smooth, heard the whistle that didn't belong, felt the eyes that weren't afraid. He wanted them to know they weren't alone. That the silence meant something. That the line between man and myth is thinner than anyone wants to admit. And still, after all of it, he wasn't sure what they wanted from him. But he knew this. Next time they came, it wouldn't be to walk beside him. It would be to walk through him. Sometimes, late at night, Dean still hears it. That low, deliberate whistle curling out of the black trees like it's made of bone and memory. It doesn't come often now. Not like before. But when it does, it never feels like the first time. It feels like a continuation. Like the next step in a conversation older than language. He doesn't chase it. He doesn't run from it either. He just listens. And in that listening, something opens. It's not peace. Peace is quiet. This is awareness. A constant hum beneath the bones. Like the air is waiting for a reply you haven't figured out how to give yet. Dean's hair has gone grayer now. Hands slower, back tighter in the morning. He doesn't hike the deep woods anymore, but he walks, every day. Just the edge of the forest, just far enough for the shadows to remember him. The paths are worn, familiar, and yet every time he steps onto them, he feels like a visitor. Like someone stepping into a cathedral where the ceiling breathes. He still doesn't talk about what he saw. Not publicly. Not to strangers. But he's told his nephew once, one time, after a storm knocked out the power, and the boy asked him why he always kept cedar bark hanging over the door. Dean looked at him for a long while, then simply said, "To be remembered the right way." That was all. But that night, the wind came strong through the trees, and the boy said he thought he heard someone calling from the woods. Not a voice, not a scream, just a sound, like someone breathing out a song without words. Dean told him not to answer it. "Not yet," he said. "Not until you're sure you've got something to offer back. Because that's what no one tells you. This isn't about sightings. It's not about proof. There are no photos that will survive what they truly are. No videos that will show the weight of them. What's real about them lives in the space after the encounter. In the way your life splits and only half of it comes back. Somewhere in that split is the truth. But it doesn't want to be named. It wants to be held. And Dean holds it now, every day. In silence. In cedar. In memory. In the way the birds hush at the same time every dusk, like someone else just stepped into the clearing. He never did find out what they wanted. Not exactly. But he knows what they gave him. A different way of seeing. A different way of being seen. And even now, with the porch light off and the fire in his chest getting smaller with each year, he still waits sometimes. For that sound. For that sound. That moment. That edge where worlds brush shoulders again. Because the real gift wasn't survival. It was this. They didn't let me see them to prove they exist. They let me see them so I'd never forget we're not the only ones who do. That's what he wants you to understand. Not the shape of them, not their scent or size or gait, but their purpose, their place, and ours. So if one night you're walking the back roads and you hear something strange, a whistle with no throat, a hush that feels full, a rustle that doesn't break anything, don't call out, don't run, just walk. And let them walk with you. In the end, stories like this aren't really about monsters or myths or what walks in the woods when no one's watching. They're about the space between what we think we know and what we quietly suspect might still be out there. They're about the ancient rhythm of things, the way the earth hums beneath our feet, the way trees lean toward the wind like they're listening, the way shadows sometimes move without asking permission. These stories remind us that not everything has to be explained to be true. That belief doesn't always require evidence. It requires humility. A willingness to admit that maybe the world isn't as small as we've made it, that just beyond the reach of our flashlights and fences, something older is still watching, not with malice, not with hunger, but with memory. There is a sacredness to mystery, and we've spent too much of our lives trying to solve what was never meant to be solved. The forest doesn't speak in our language. It never has. But it leaves signs for those willing to pay attention. It leaves spaces where silence teaches more than sound, where absence becomes presence, where the unknown isn't a threat, it's an invitation. Some truths aren't meant to be proven. They're meant to be experienced, because the moment we believe we've cataloged every creature, mapped every shadow, named every fear, we stop listening, and the world, in turn, grows quieter. Not because there's nothing left to say, but because we've forgotten how to hear. So maybe the real lesson isn't in what was seen, but in what was felt. The sense that we are not alone, that the world is wider, deeper, more alive than our systems and screens have allowed us to remember. That there are still paths unwritten, still places where the veil is thinner than we realize. And in those places, maybe what we call myth is really just the part of truth we're not ready to carry yet. So walk gently, listen well, and when the wind shifts and the trees go still, and you hear something distant calling from the dark, don't be so quick to silence it. Let wonder live there. Let the old things breathe. After all, some stories aren't told to be understood. They're told so we remember we belong to something more. Thank you for walking through this journey with us. If this story stirred something in you, an echo, a memory, a question, please share it. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you'd like to hear more stories that tread the thin places between truth and legend, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow this channel. Because the woods are never quiet for long, and neither are we.